A Pony Named Shawney by Mary Small, illustrated by Susie Stevenson. Contents: A pony named Shawney. New neighbors. Scott thinks of a plan. Jody lends a hand. Why not try? Shawney does the walking. A new pony. A Pony Named Shawney. Scott had never thought about riding a pony until he met Shawney. All through the long, wet winter, the big field at the end of the garden lay empty. Only the birds flew there to search for grubs. The field belonged to the old house next door to Scott's home. Then, after school one day, Scott saw Shawney standing there close to the fence. She was the prettiest pony he had ever seen, a soft, smoky gray color with thick, shaggy mane and tail so long it almost brushed the ground. As Scott came close, she peered at him inquisitively with gentle brown eyes and nickered a friendly greeting. He knew her name was Shawney because it was written in bold red letters on the rug she was wearing. It seemed just the right name for her. Shawney, he called, and she thrust her soft muzzle through the wire towards his outstretched hand. Don't touch her! Scott turned to see his mother walking toward him. You have to be careful with ponies. Sometimes they kick or bite, she said. She's not yours, so you better leave her alone. The next morning, Shawney was still in the field, and she was there again in the afternoon. When Scott came home from school, she was there the next day and the next, always waiting at the fence, ears pricked up hopefully. She already knew Scott would throw her bread when nobody was looking. It was good, tasty bread. Scott's father was the town baker, and in Scott's home there was always the warm, fresh smell of baking bread from the bakery next door. On Saturday, when Scott was talking to Shawney through the fence, 3 children appeared at the far end of the field. Shawney, come on, Shawney, they called. With an excited whiny and a toss of her head, the pony turned away from Scott and trotted off briskly. Scott watched a little enviously as the children stroked the pony and fed her carrots. Then they put a bridle on her and led her out of sight. For a long time Scott sat staring after them. If only I had a pony like Shawney, she could do the walking for me, he thought. Scott was unable to walk. Often people felt sorry for him, but mostly he didn't mind so much. He had never known what it felt like to be able to walk. Scott could just manage to get around on a pair of crutches, but very slowly. He spent most of his time in his wheelchair. It was nearly as good as a car. He could go almost anywhere in it, as long as he avoided loose stones, curbs, and steps. He had lost count of how many times the wheelchair had run away with him, helter-skelter, and tipped him out onto the ground. But except for the scratches and the bruises, he was never hurt. The boy's made of rubber, his father said. He'll never learn to be careful enough. All the same, he's got plenty of guts. New neighbors. On Sunday, Scott wheeled himself up to the fence as usual. He hoped he would see Shawney again. There she was with the 3 children. One of the boys was sitting on the pony. The girl was leading Shawney by the bridle. They passed quite close to Scott, but the boy took no notice of him. The girl looked right at him, but she didn't smile. Then they went off to the far end of the field. Scott felt sad. He would have liked to say hello. Perhaps the children had felt awkward because he was in a wheelchair. Perhaps they felt they shouldn't stare at him. When he got home, Scott asked his mother, "Who does Shawney belong to?" "Shawney?" she asked. "Oh, you mean that little pony. She must belong to the new family who have come to live in the old house. The letter carrier told me that there are 3 children there at the moment. We might visit them. Would you like that?" Scott wasn't sure. He remembered the girl's unsmiling glance and the way the boys hadn't looked at him at all. The next day after school, Shawney was back at the fence looking for Scott. She whined a greeting and took a piece of bread that he held out for her. "Scott!" He turned and saw his mother behind him. "It's all right, Mom," he said. "See if—" I hold my hand flat and put the bread on it. She can't bite my fingers, even by mistake. Maybe, but bread really isn't good for ponies, Scott, his mother told him. I didn't know that, Scott said. I won't give her any more. I'll just talk to her. All right, but be careful, his mother said. Oh, Shawney, Scott whispered when his mother had gone. I wish I could get on your back and ride you. Think of having strong legs to walk with instead of these two useless ones. Scott thinks of a plan. The day after that, Scott went again to the field fence. It's just talking now, no bread to eat, he told Shawney. But just talking didn't suit Shawney at all. When Scott put out his hand to pet her, she turned away, but she watched him a while. She grazed just a little distance away in case he had some bread after all. Scott could tell Shawney was losing interest in him. Each day after that, she was a little bit further away from the fence. Then Scott made a plan. On Saturday, when his mom was out shopping, he took several pieces of bread from the kitchen. Then he quickly wheeled himself out of the house and across the yard, under the clothesline and up to the fence. He spied Shawney in the corner of the field, dozing. Shawney! Come, Shawney! Scott held out the bread. Shawney came towards him at once, whining softly. Careful, he said as she grabbed the bread. Don't be greedy. He watched while Shawney ate the first piece of bread. Then, looking around to make sure no one could see him, he set the brakes on his wheelchair and tipped himself out onto the ground. Shawney backed away as Scott dragged himself along the ground towards the fence, elbowing himself along on his tummy. He threw her a second piece of bread, and as she ate it, he squeezed under the fence wire. He lay there panting, looking up at the pony. Here, he held out another piece and she took it. Shawney looked much bigger than usual from where Scott lay on the ground. Slowly and carefully he edged nearer her. She watched him warily, her nostrils flaring, her long tail swishing slowly. The strap on Shawney's rug was now within Scott's reach. He put both hands up to grab hold of it. Shawney, alarmed, stepped sideways, and Scott lost his hold and fell flat on his face. What on earth are you doing? A voice exclaimed. Jody lends a hand. Scott lifted his head. The girl stood there staring down at him in amazement. Awkwardly, he tried to sit up. Nothing, he said miserably. He wished he could suddenly disappear down a rabbit hole. Then the girl's expression changed from anger to embarrassment. She was looking at his leg braces. Oh, I forgot. Can't you walk at all? She asked in a voice not much louder than a whisper. No, said Scott, but I don't mind. Not really. I don't even know what it feels like to be able to walk. He looked at the girl's sturdy legs. What does it feel like? He asked. I don't know, just like walking, I suppose, the girl said, shrugging her shoulders. Suddenly she dropped to the ground beside Scott and pulled up a piece of grass and chewed it thoughtfully. Isn't it awful not being able to walk? She asked. A little bit awful, Scott said, but I don't think about it all that much. At school I do exercises that will make my legs stronger. One day I may be able to walk with crutches. But I can go most places in my wheelchair. The girl looked at the wheelchair standing empty on the other side of the fence. My name's Jody, she said. Jody McBain. Mine's Scott Anderson. How old are you? 7. I'm 9, nearly 10, Jody told him. We've come here from Maine. Mom likes the weather better here in Massachusetts. Who were those boys with you the other day? Scott asked. My cousins, Michael and Roger. They've gone home now. They were only staying with us. I do have a brother, Russ, but he's a lot older than me. Jody paused, and then she asked, what were you trying to do just now? I wanted to try to get on Shawnee's back, just to see if she would do the walking for me, Scott said. But she wouldn't even stand still. Shawnee is very old, Jody said. She's 23. We've had her for years and years, but she's still lively. Jody thought for a moment. Then she said slowly, Would you really like to ride Shawnee? Oh, yes, said Scott. Then he added, I don't know if Mom and Dad would let me. Though, that's why I tried to get on Shawnee while they weren't home. Mom doesn't seem to like ponies much. I'll ask my dad about it. About riding Shawnee, I mean, Jody said. Maybe it will help if he talks to your parents. Jody got up. Can you get home all right? She asked him. Yes. Okay, see you later. Why not try? Scott's mother noticed his muddy clothes when she came home from shopping, but she didn't ask any questions. She just said, Oh, Scott, you fell out of your wheelchair again. Scott smiled to himself. He had decided to keep his adventure a secret and wait and see if Jody's father came to talk to his parents. He felt pretty excited all the same. That evening, just as everyone sat down to dinner, there was a knock at the door. Scott's father opened it. A stranger stood there with Jody beside him. Does Scott live here? The man asked. Scott's mother got up from the table. That's right, this is my son, Scott. She laid a hand on Scott's shoulder. Let me introduce myself. I'm your new neighbor, Ivor McBain. This is my daughter, Jody, and out there in the driveway is my son, Russ, with Shawnee. Scott leaned forward in his chair to see a glimpse of a tall boy standing outside with a pony. He glanced at Jody. She grinned at him. I understand from what Jody that Scott would like to ride, Mr. McBain said. That's why we brought Shawnee with us. Ride? Scott's mother gasped. Ride Shawnee? Wherever did you get that idea? Everyone looked at Scott. He took a deep breath. If somebody lifted me up onto Shawnee, I'm sure I could stay on, he said, sounding as confident as he could. He looked at his father. Please let me try, Dad. It's not impossible, Jody's father said. These days, quite a lot of physically challenged children learn to ride. Shawnee is only little, Scott pointed out. Please, Mom. Please, Dad. You know how strong my arms are from working the wheelchair, and the teachers at school say the more exercise I get, the better. His mom and Dad looked at each other. Well, I don't see why not, said Mr. Anderson. If he falls off, he'll bounce. I've always said he's made of rubber. Mr. Anderson lifted his son from his wheelchair and carried him outside to Shawnee and Russ. Hi, said Russ. Very carefully, Mr. Anderson lifted Scott onto the saddle. Scott grabbed the front of the saddle for safety. He felt very high off the ground. Put the riding hat on, Jody said, and we'll shorten the stirrups. Stand still, Shawnee. You look fine, said Russ, smiling at Scott. How does it feel? Great, said Scott. Can we go for a ride now? Sure, just keep tight hold of the front saddle and we'll see that Shawnee behaves. Another time we'll teach you how to hold the reins. Russ walked on one side and Mr. McBrain on the other. Jody took the reins. She led Shawnee up and down the backyard very slowly so that Scott could get used to the pony's movement. It was very strange to feel Shawnee's warm, strong body moving beneath him and to watch her head move up and down in front. Once or twice, Shawnee stopped suddenly and Scott fell forward onto her thick, wiry mane. I think that is enough, said Mr. McBain, at least for today. We'll do this again very soon, maybe next weekend. Scott's body ached that night. His head spun with excitement. For a long time he lay in bed, unable to sleep, thinking of Shawnee and his ride and all the wonderful things that they would do one day. At last he fell asleep, dreaming of ranches, open fields, and fast galloping horses. Shawnee does the walking. From that time on, Saturday afternoons never came around quickly enough for Scott, for that was when Mr. McBain or Russ and Jody always came with Shawnee to teach Scott to ride. After only a few lessons, Scott felt less unbalanced and found he could sit up much straighter without trying so hard. He could even let go of the saddle and hold on to the reins, but he still held on to Shawnee's thick mane as well for safety. Somehow Shawnee seemed to know that riding was not easy for Scott. She always walked along quietly, but Scott still needed someone to walk by his side. If they turned a corner too sharply, he could lose his balance and fall off. When can we trot? He asked Russ one day, as soon as they came back along the grass beside the road. Now, if you like, Russ said. but you'll have to shorten the reins, gather them up, and push into the saddle with your body so Shawney knows you want her to move faster." Scott got ready, and then Russ slapped Shawney on the rump and made a giddy-up noises. The pony broke into a trot. "Oh, stop, stop," cried Scott, grabbing wildly at Shawney's mane as he found himself bumping out of control. "Whoa," called Russ, slowing the pony down to a walk. "Maybe we'll leave trotting for a while," he said. "You'll manage it, but not just yet. You need more practice at walking first." When Scott had been riding for several weeks, his legs began to feel just a little stronger. If he held on a table or a chair, he could pull himself up and stand for a while on his own. Then it was Christmas, and the long winter vacation began, and suddenly everything started to go wrong. "We're off to Virginia for vacation," Jody announced one day, "and we'll be taking Shawney. We're going to stay with my aunt and uncle and Michael and Roger." Scott stared at her. "Going to Virginia? For how long?" "The whole vacation. But you'll be able to ride again when we get back." Scott thought the winter vacation would never end. The days dragged on. He missed Shawney dreadfully. His parents took him to the movies or for drives in the country, but it wasn't the same as riding Shawney. Often Scott went to the field, hoping the McBains might have come home early from their trip, but only a mob of sheep grazing there, pulling at the dry yellow grass with quick, sharp bites. As soon as Scott came close, they hurried away to a safe distance to stand and stare at him. Each morning he woke up to the sound of their baaing and bleating instead of the whinnying of a pony. When Scott talked about Shawney at home, saying how much he missed her, his father would just smile and wink across to his mother and say, "Never mind, son. You'll be riding again. Be patient." Sometimes, lying in bed at night, Scott would listen to the old roof creaking, think enviously of Michael and Roger, Jody's cousins, riding Shawney in Virginia. When at last he fell asleep, he saw Shawney in his dreams, but he could never quite reach her. A new pony. Finally, the weeks passed. Winter vacation was over, and it was time to go back to school. And still, Shawney had not returned. One evening, as Scott sat in his wheelchair watching television, there was a loud knock at the door. His mother went to answer it. He heard the sounds of a whispering and muffled laughter. The next moment, she came hurrying into the room. "I think you'd better come outside." She pushed Scott along the passage to the front door, and there, standing in the yard, was Scott's father and all the McBains and Shawney. But was it Shawney? Surely his eyes must be playing tricks on him, Scott thought. The pony seemed bigger than he remembered her, and a darker gray. He sat there, staring at the pony. The pony stared back at him with equal interest, it seemed. "Well, haven't you anything to say?" asked his father. "How do you like your new pony?" Scott was speechless for a moment. "My pony? What do you mean, Dad? My pony? What about Shawney?" "We left Shawney in Virginia with Jody's cousins," Miss McBain said. "She's getting to be quite an old lady now." So we looked around for another pony and found Dusty. And here he is. He's a present from your parents. Scott looked at his mother and father, who stood there smiling. "It wasn't easy to keep it all a secret," Scott's mother said. Dusty. Scott echoed the name, still scarcely able to believe it was true. "He's only 7 years old," said Jody. "The same as you, Scott. It took us ages to find him. We knew you'd want a pony as much like Shawney as possible." "Do you want to meet him?" Scott's father asked. "Oh, yes," said Scott. Mr. McBain picked up Scott and took him over to Dusty, who nickered softly as Scott stroked his forehead. Scott looked across at his mother and Mr. McBain. "Does he really belong to me?" "Head, tail, and all 4 legs," his mother said. "We're going to make a gate in the fence and build a shelter shed for him in the field," said Mr. McBain. Jody will help you exercise him and keep his saddle and bridle clean." Thanks a lot," was all Scott could say, but everybody was standing around could see just how pleased and proud he felt to have a pony of his own. Now Dusty would do the walking for him, and that, as far as Scott was concerned, was just about the greatest thing in the world.